Power has a scent, and in the age of King Henry VIII, that scent was not of rosewater and spice, but of an inescapable, creeping decay. We imagine the Tudor court as a grand tapestry of gold thread, royal purple, and gleaming jewels, a world of magnificent ceremony and absolute authority. Yet beneath this shimmering veneer of power, a far more pungent reality festered, an unseen kingdom of filth that thrived in the very heart of royal splendor. This is not a story of kings and queens as they are remembered in portraiture, but a journey into the suffocating miasma they called home, an exploration of a palace where the effluence of 1,000 souls threatened to drown its grandeur. The primary architectural response to this relentless biological tide was not one of sophisticated engineering but of crude, almost brutal diversion. For the privileged few whose chambers were situated within the thick outer walls of the palace, sanitation was a small, cold closet known as the garderobe, a name that euphemistically suggested a place for storing robes, but whose true function was far more elemental. It was a simple stone or timber seat, perched over a vertical chute, a direct and unceremonious conduit to the world below. What it offered in privacy, it surrendered in its contribution to a greater, collective horror: the palace moat. This defensive ring of water, once a proud symbol of fortification, was transformed by 100 such chutes into a stagnant, putrid necklace of raw sewage, a festering collar of human effluence that encircled the heart of the kingdom. In the heat of summer, an almost visible miasma would rise from its murky depths, an inescapable perfume of decay that seeped back through the very stones of the palace, a constant reminder of the filth that lay just beyond the walls. But for the vast majority of the court, even this grim convenience was a luxury. At the great palace of Hampton Court, a more ambitious solution was constructed, a monument to communal necessity known as the Great House of Easement. This was no private closet but a grand, two-story brick edifice, a veritable temple of defecation. Inside, on long, polished oak beams, sat places for 28 men, side by side, with no partitions or screens to afford a shred of dignity. Here, the great lords and the humble clerks of the court sat together in a bizarre tableau of social leveling, their conversations mingling with the sounds of their shared biological purpose. This great cloaca did not empty into the moat. Its vast brick-lined drain, a marvel of Tudor engineering, channeled the combined waste of the court's elite on a far grander journey, discharging it all directly into the flowing waters of the River Thames, poisoning the very artery of the nation with the refuse of its ruling class. Yet even these monumental efforts to institutionalize filth were but islands of order in an ocean of chaos. For where formal structures failed to serve the immediate needs of 1,000 unconstrained bodies, a far more intimate and pervasive form of squalor took root. The true sanitary reality of the Tudor palace was not found in the grand communal latrine, but in the humble chamber pot, the ubiquitous ceramic or pewter vessel that was the constant companion of every courtier, high and low. These pots, filled throughout the day and night, represented 1,000 individual streams of waste that had to find their way out into the world. And their journey was often short and brutally direct. The air of the palace's many courtyards was frequently punctuated by the sharp cry of "Gardyloo!" a hasty warning before the contents of a pot were unceremoniously hurled from a window above, splashing onto the cobblestones or muddy ground below. These enclosed spaces, meant to be oases of light and air, were transformed into fetid, sodden arenas of refuse, landscapes of casual contamination where one had to tread with extreme care. But the true horror, the detail that speaks most profoundly of the era's disconnect from our modern sensibilities, was that the waste did not always make it outside. In a sprawling complex of endless corridors, winding staircases, and hidden alcoves, the journey to a designated privy or even a window could be long and inconvenient. Thus, the palace itself became a latrine. Courtiers, driven by expediency, would relieve themselves directly into the ornate fireplaces of unused chambers, the dark corners of hallways, or even behind the magnificent, priceless tapestries that lined the walls, their beautiful woven scenes of myth and history concealing a creeping reality of dampness and decay. The problem became so endemic, so corrosive to the decorum of the court, that the king himself was forced to issue official proclamations, edicts that explicitly forbade any person from urinating or defecating within the palace's corridors and great chambers. The existence of such a law is the most damning evidence of the crime. The great houses of the Tudor dynasty were rotting not from the outside in, but from the inside out, drowning in the very tide of humanity they were built to contain. If the air was thick with the ammonia of casual urination, and the courtyards were treacherous landscapes of hurled refuse, then the very ground upon which the court walked was a far more patient, and perhaps more insidious, repository of squalor. The great stone floors of the palace were not left bare to the cold, but were covered, for warmth and comfort, with a thick carpet of freshly cut rushes or straw. When first laid, this flooring would fill the grand halls with the sweet, clean scent of the meadow, a temporary illusion of pastoral purity. But the illusion was fleeting. The principle of maintenance was not one of replacement, but of accumulation. When the top layer became too soiled, too flattened and stained by the passage of 1,000 daily footsteps, it was not stripped away and burned. Instead, a new layer of fresh rushes was simply strewn over the old, burying the filth under a thin veneer of freshness. This process, repeated over months, and sometimes, unimaginably, over years, created a kind of geological stratification of decay. The Dutch scholar Erasmus, visiting England during this period, recorded his profound horror at this practice, describing a compressed, festering mat that in some homes had lain undisturbed for 2 decades. He chronicled what lay within this vile substrate: an unholy concoction of spilled ale and grease from the feasting tables, discarded bones gnawed clean by dogs, the spittle and vomit of courtiers, the urine of both men and their animals, and countless other unnameable organic remnants. Every footstep upon this dense, damp carpet would press the filth deeper, or worse, release a small puff of putrid, ancient air. The floor was not a floor at all. It was a living organism of filth, a shallow, undocumented grave for the daily detritus of the court, a spongy, decomposing archive of every meal, every accident, every moment of casual indiscretion, ensuring that the inhabitants of these magnificent halls were never truly free of the filth they created, for they walked upon its history with every step they took, with the very ground beneath their feet a testament to accumulated decay, and the air a thick cocktail of waste and refuse. The modern mind naturally turns to the question of personal cleanliness, seeking some solace in the image of a perfumed noble rising clean from a steaming bath. But this is a fantasy born of a different age. For in the Tudor worldview, the act of bathing was not a path to health but a direct invitation to death. The prevailing medical philosophy of the time was not one of germs, but of miasmas. The belief that disease was carried on foul, pestilential air, and that the human body's greatest defense was its own sealed integrity. To immerse oneself in hot water was to commit an act of profound recklessness. It was to open the pores of the skin, rendering the body as vulnerable as an undefended fortress, allowing the invisible poisons of the air to rush in and corrupt the humors. Thus, the avoidance of bathing was a deliberate, calculated act of self-preservation. In its place, the aristocracy practiced a form of dry cleaning, vigorously rubbing their skin with fine linen cloths to absorb the sweat and grime of the day, and changing their linen undergarments frequently, allowing the clean fabric to wick away the body's impurities. This was the mark of a truly wealthy individual. Not the scent of soap, but the ability to afford a fresh layer of pristine white linen each morning. For the vast majority, however, such luxuries were unimaginable. The result was a constant, pervasive human odor, a baseline reality of sweat and stale skin that became the universal backdrop to courtly life. The entire culture of scent was therefore not one of enhancement, but of desperate defense. Perfumes were not an affectation, but a necessity, a form of olfactory armor. Courtiers drenched themselves in powerful, heavy scents of musk and civet, not to attract, but to repel, to carve out a small, breathable space in the suffocating press of unwashed humanity. They carried pomanders, ornate metal spheres filled with ambergris and spices, which they held to their noses like drowning men gasping for a final lungful of clean air. A constant, futile battle to mask the undeniable truth of their own unwashed existence. And yet, at the very epicenter of this swirling universe of human odor and accumulated waste, there existed a zone of almost unimaginable exception, a sanctuary where the rules of miasma and the fear of water were held in abeyance by the sheer, unassailable force of royal will. For the king himself, Henry VIII, did not subscribe to the same hygienic privations as his subjects. Existing on an island of impossible purity amidst the sea of his court's collective filth, while his nobles scrubbed themselves with linen and held spices to their noses, the king commanded a level of sanitary technology that was nothing short of miraculous for the 16th century. At his beloved palaces, most notably Hampton Court, he had constructed for his personal use a bathroom of astonishing sophistication. Here, a dedicated servant known as the groom of the stool, a position of incredible intimacy and influence, would oversee the royal ablutions, a process aided by the almost magical provision of hot and cold running water, delivered through a complex system of brass taps controlled by a specialized tender called a turncock. This was not the quick, fearful splash of a nervous courtier, but a deliberate and luxurious ritual of cleansing. In this steam-filled chamber, lined with fine wood and hung with rich tapestries, the king could soak in a deep tub, washing away the grime and sweat of the day with expensive, scented soaps, his body anointed with fragrant oils, a stark and almost blasphemous contradiction to the medical wisdom of his own physicians. But this personal fastidiousness, this royal obsession with cleanliness, was a profoundly isolating act. It did nothing to cleanse the palace itself. Rather, it served only to highlight the vast, unbridgeable chasm between the sovereign and his people. The king's clean body was a symbol of his unique status, as separate from the unwashed masses of his own court as his divine right separated him from their laws and their mortality. He was a single, pristine man, moving through a world of his own making that was actively rotting around him. His personal comfort a bubble of fragrant denial in the face of the overwhelming, festering truth of his kingdom. If the king's private chamber was an island of purity, then the palace kitchens were the kingdom's volcanic heart, a vast and terrifying engine of consumption whose byproduct was a constant, gushing torrent of organic filth. From the outside, the kitchens were the source of the legendary Tudor feasts, the origin point of the roasted swans, the towering pies, and the mountains of glistening meats that proclaimed the wealth and virility of the monarch. But to step inside this sprawling complex of storerooms, larders, and boiling houses was to enter a different realm, a Dantean inferno of roaring fires, choking smoke, and the ceaseless, frantic labor of hundreds of servants. Here, the scale of royal hospitality was rendered in its most brutal form. The daily sustenance of over 1,000 courtiers required an unceasing procession of death. Entire herds of oxen and flocks of sheep were driven into the palace grounds to be slaughtered on sight, their lifeblood staining the cobblestones, and their death cries echoing off the same walls that housed the king. This was industry on a terrifying scale, and it produced waste to match. There were no refrigerated lorries, no sanitary disposal units. The byproducts of the feast were dealt with in the most immediate and expedient manner possible. Buckets brimming with hot, steaming entrails were hauled from the butchering sheds and dumped into piles in the nearest courtyard. Rivers of blood and greasy water were sluiced out through channels that fed directly into the already overburdened moat or the Thames. Great mounds of bones, stripped of their meat, were piled high, awaiting eventual collection. This ever-present, ever-growing mass of decaying animal matter added a new and uniquely nauseating chorus to the palace's symphony of stench. The sickly, sweet odor of old blood and the sharp, rancid smell of rotting fat. The Tudor court, in its insatiable hunger, had created a permanent open-air banquet, not for its nobles, but for the swarming legions of flies, maggots, and rats that would soon come to define life within the royal residence. Where the banquet of human and animal waste was laid, the uninvited guests would inevitably arrive to feast. The palaces of Henry VIII were not merely home to his court. They were a thriving, self-sustaining ecosystem for an entirely different kingdom, a shadow court of vermin that held dominion in the walls, floors, and fabrics of the royal residence. This was the logical, living consequence of all the filth that had been so meticulously detailed. The great, festering rush floors were not just a carpet of decay, but a teeming metropolis for fleas and a hunting ground for the sleek, dark bodies of rats and mice that skittered through its compressed layers. The magnificent, costly tapestries that depicted heroic battles and biblical allegories were themselves hosts to a slower, more patient invasion, their thick woolen threads providing a perfect, continent-sized habitat for colonies of lice and their tenacious eggs. And at night, when the court finally sought rest, there was no true escape. For the very beds in which they slept were themselves compromised. The straw-stuffed mattresses, warm and dark and infused with the sweat of their human occupants, were a paradise for the insidious bedbug, which would emerge from the seams and crevices to feed in the quiet hours of the morning. This was a truly democratic affliction, an infestation that did not recognize the carefully constructed hierarchies of the court. A louse would make its home in the immaculately coiffed hair of a lady-in-waiting as readily as in the matted locks of a scullery maid. A flea born in the rushes would leap onto the velvet hose of a duke with the same voracious indifference it showed to a stable boy. There was no sanctuary. Life was lived to a constant, maddening soundtrack of tiny, skittering feet in the walls and a persistent, inescapable itching of the skin. The vermin were the true inheritors of the Tudor palace, a silent, swarming army that thrived on the decay. A constant, crawling reminder that for all its gold and grandeur, the court of Henry VIII was a kingdom built upon, and slowly being consumed by, its own magnificent filth. With the palace now established as a thriving dominion for vermin and a repository of every conceivable form of human and animal waste, the final, inevitable consequence began to manifest itself not as a visible entity, but as an invisible, silent scourge. This was the age before the knowledge of germs, a time when disease was a mysterious phantom, a malevolent alignment of the stars, a punishment from God, or a foul miasma that rose from the corrupted earth. Yet, while the Tudors lacked the science to comprehend the mechanism of their doom, they could not escape its brutal effects. The very conditions they had created transformed the royal court from a fortress of power into a meticulously crafted death trap. The water they sometimes drew from the Thames, thick with the effluent of the Great House of Easement, became a vector for the bloody flux, a violent dysentery that would hollow a man out from the inside, leaving him a desiccated husk. The fleas that feasted on the rats in the walls and the rushes on the floors carried their own microscopic agents of death, spreading pestilence with every bite. But no affliction struck more terror into the hearts of the court than the mysterious English sweating sickness, a uniquely terrifying plague that moved with the speed of a striking viper. A courtier could be in perfect health at breakfast, complaining of a slight chill by lunch, and be dead before the evening meal, their body having been racked by a violent fever, profuse sweating, and a swift, agonizing shutdown of their vital functions. This was not a slow, wasting illness. It was a biological ambush, and it turned the glittering halls of the palace into a gallery of paranoia. Every cough, every bead of sweat, every momentary weakness was viewed with suspicion and terror. The court, designed to be a showcase for the king's magnificent vitality, became a place where death was the most constant and unpredictable courtier of all. A silent guest who moved unseen through the crowded chambers, born of the very filth that the court so carelessly produced. A relentless, invisible harvest reaped from the seeds of their own squalor. Faced with an environment that had become a self-perpetuating engine of disease, a fortress whose very foundations were saturated with the agents of its own destruction, the Tudor court adopted the only solution available to it, a solution of radical and perpetual motion. The celebrated royal progress, that great and glittering procession of the monarch through the shires of his kingdom, is often framed by history as a matter of political theater and logistical necessity, a way for the king to see and be seen by his subjects while consuming the resources of his wealthiest nobles. But beneath this stately veneer lay a far more primal, more desperate motivation. The court was not merely progressing. it was fleeing. It was a kingdom of royal fugitives, constantly on the run from an enemy of its own creation, its own stench. When a palace, be it Whitehall, Greenwich, or Hampton Court, had absorbed its absolute capacity for filth, when the rush floors had become a biohazard, the moat a black soup of sewage, and the very air a thick, unbreathable fume of decay, the order would be given. The great exodus would begin. 1,000 courtiers, servants, and officials would pack the royal treasure, the tapestries, the furniture, and the machinery of government, and begin the slow, ponderous journey to the next royal residence, a residence that had been resting, empty and clean, awaiting their arrival. They were running away from the consequences of their own existence, seeking temporary asylum in a place not yet saturated with their presence. Left behind, in the echoing halls of the abandoned palace, a skeleton crew of hardy servants would begin the Herculean task of the great cleansing. The ancient, rotting rushes would be scraped from the floors and burned in great pyres, the stone flags scrubbed with sand and lye, the cesspits emptied in the dead of night by the grim gong farmers, and the windows thrown wide to the winds, allowing the building, for a few precious months, to breathe again, to purge itself of the human pestilence it had housed. This was the great unspoken cycle of Tudor power. To arrive, to consume, to befoul, and to flee, leaving a trail of exhausted palaces in their wake, each one a monument to a court so powerful it could command a nation, yet so primitive it could be routed by its own magnificent, inescapable filth. To truly understand this lost world, one must attempt the impossible, to breathe its air, to reconstruct the overwhelming olfactory reality that was the very essence of life in Henry's court. It was a symphony of stench, a complex and layered assault on the senses, composed in movements of escalating decay. The bass note, the deep and foundational hum upon which all else was built, was the smell of the earth and water, turned against themselves. It was the heavy, sulphurous breath of the moat, a wet and cloying odor of human waste left to fester under the sun, a smell that clung to the stone walls and rose like a ghostly tide on humid evenings. Upon this foundation was built the second movement, the smell of the great halls themselves. This was the scent of the rushes, a musty, mildewed odor of damp, rotting vegetation, sharpened by the acrid tang of stale beer, the sourness of spilled wine, and the faint, persistent ghost of 20 years of accumulated refuse, a smell that puffed up from the floor with every single footstep. Then came the brutal, visceral scent of the kitchens, a percussive blast of animal reality, the coppery, metallic smell of fresh blood, the rancid stink of boiling fat, and the sweet, nauseating perfume of entrails and offal piled in the courtyards, a constant, unavoidable reminder of the ceaseless cycle of slaughter required to feed the court. Woven through all of this was the most intimate and pervasive smell of all, the scent of humanity itself. It was the sour, pungent odor of 1,000 unwashed bodies, the animal warmth of sweat-soaked wool and linen, the stale breath of decaying teeth, a fog of human presence that was thickest in the crowded presence chamber. And then, crashing over all of it, came the final, desperate movement, the scent of denial. This was the sharp, cloying sweetness of the court's perfumes, the heavy clouds of incense, the fragrant spices of the pomanders, a frantic attempt to mask the horror. But these scents did not conceal. They merely competed, creating a final, nightmarish accord, a sickening cacophony of rosewater and rot, of musk and mildew, of spice and sewage, a smell so profoundly disgusting, so completely overwhelming, that it became the defining, unspoken truth of a golden age. And so, we are left with a profound and unsettling paradox, the great and enduring contradiction of the Tudor age. We look at the portraits left behind by the master painters, the severe, commanding gaze of the king, the pale, serene faces of his queens, and we see an image of supreme order, of immense wealth and unshakable authority, a world rendered in the crisp, clean lines of genius. We read the histories, the chronicles of great battles, of seismic shifts in religion and politics, and we imagine a world of high purpose and grand design. But this is the great lie that history tells. The carefully curated illusion that power projects to conceal its own messy, organic, and often disgusting truth. The story of Henry VIII's court is a testament to the fact that magnificence is often a mask, that the most glittering of golden ages can be built upon a literal foundation of filth. The gold thread in the tapestry, the gleam of the jewels, the soaring rhetoric of the royal proclamation, all were part of a desperate and continuous act of propaganda, an effort to impose a narrative of divine order and cleanliness upon a reality of chaotic, uncontrollable decay. The filth was not a mere footnote to the grandeur. It was its inseparable shadow, the secret price of concentrating so much life and power in one place. It serves as a stark reminder that the past we inherit is always an edited version, a story from which the most visceral and unpleasant details have been scrubbed clean. The true legacy of Henry's court is therefore not just its art or its politics, but this crucial, cautionary lesson that we must always question the beautiful surfaces of power and wonder what unseen, unrecorded foulness lies just beneath, in the dark and silent layers of a history that has no smell.